Thank you all for being here today, and I'm excited to share this project that I've been working on families, work and welfare states. And the study is guided by one main research question: how do family events impact household income trajectories in the long term? In this study, I focus on first family formation events, that is, first co-residential union and the birth of a first child to different sex couples. So past scholarship on the effects of family events on labor market outcomes has typically taken a within-group time invariant estimation approach towards estimating individuals' wage returns to family events. That is, we know much about the effects of marriage premiums, particularly what concerns men's returns to marriage. And we know much on economic returns to parenthood, particularly in what regards motherhood penalties. So while examining the individual consequences of marriage and parenthood is essential for understanding inequalities at the intersection of gender and work, I argue here that the focus on the individual as the central unit of analysis overlooks the family as a foundational site of social stratification. So the family both shapes and is shaped by the labor market outcomes of gender and egalitarian practices arising from these life events. So considering this, the lack of longitudinal comparative research on the economic consequences of family events for within household income inequalities across the life course is a significant gap in the social stratification literature. In this paper, I propose a framework of what I'm calling a family-triggered stratification trajectory model. And this model aims to combine these logically interrelated, but that have largely developed in parallel of each other literatures on family earnings gaps and gender inequality in labor market outcomes. So basically, what usually we have in the literature, we'll have something like earnings or wages, we'll have first marriage events, and we'll compare male singles with husbands. So we'll see what happens when people are married and when they're single, we'll compare their earnings. And then we'll call that the male marital premium. For fatherhood, we'll have something similar, although we're comparing fathers with non-fathers, including those that are non-married. Usually that's what happens in the literature. What I'm trying to do is net out these different components to get at what I'm calling the male family life course premium. Similarly, for women, we'll have female singles compared to wives, that's the first family event, and we'll have the female marital penalty. Then when motherhood comes in, well, after first childbirth, we'll have the net motherhood penalty, and from that, we'll get the female life course premium. If we combine to these elements the welfare state policy systems of transfer and taxes, we get at the family life course income trajectory. So this proposes that first family formation events, they restructure the distribution of earnings within couples, and that these trigger long-term shifts in households' income trajectories that are a direct function of labor market gender returns to family events and of welfare states buffering mechanisms. So drawing on this theoretical model, the empirical analysis in the study is developed in three main steps that addresses three main research questions that I'll walk you through now. So in the first question, I investigate changes in women's share of couples' earnings following the birth of a first child to the couple. So these are couples in first residential unions who were never in a prior co-residential partnership and that had no prior kids before entering the union. I look at women's share of couples' earnings as my main variable of interest, measured as women's share of couples' combined annual labor market earnings. I run a fixed effects model as a time event. So I'm interested really in this first component here, which are time from first childbirth. So these are a set of dummies indicating time from first childbirth to the couple, with the reference being 2 years prior to the birth of the first child. And then I have a set of time varying controls right over here. So number of children in the household who are 18 or younger and cohabiting status, women's and men's age and year. And here I have a couple fixed effects. Differently from step 1, in step 2, I test estimates separately for each country and gender group. So the objective here is to see whether men do in fact receive earnings premiums for family events and if women incur penalties. So this outcome now we have log earnings for individual I at time T of gender G in country C. This term over here is trying to capture potential experience, which captures wage and wage growth by controlling for the linear and square terms of potential experience. Now, given that marriage and parenthood are often closely tied events, in supplementary data analysis, I follow recent research to test if marriage penalties confound child penalties by conducting a stacked event study, which I can speak more about, or you can email me if you're interested in this topic. Now, for unbiased estimates, the strict exogeneity assumption must hold, and this basically means that this error term cannot be correlated with the independent variables across all time periods. So the strict exogeneity of covariates will be violated if the parallel trends assumption does not hold. So the parallel trends assumption stipulates that absent treatment, so for example, marriage, the treated, the married, and control groups, the unmarried, would have followed the same trend over time. Any deviation from this constant trend after the treatment is attributed to the treatment's effect. This is a strong assumption, as many of you likely know, that will be violated if the steepness of earnings trajectories varies across treatment groups. So a way to relax this assumption is to allow each individual to have not only their own intercept, but also their own slope. As such, I compare these traditional fixed effects models with fixed effects individual slopes models that allows each individual to have also their own slopes. Now, finally, to test the effects of childbirth and household income trajectories and the buffering effects of countries' taxes and transfer systems, I run 3 event study models on 3 dependent variables. The first is pre-tax household income, the post-tax and government transfers household income, and difference model of logged pre-tax minus the logged post-tax household income. Again, here we go back to a couple fixed effects because I'm interested in what's happening at the household level. Now, the data I use to answer these questions come from the cross-national equivalent file that I rely on the CNEF basically for their harmonized variables and earnings and number of hours worked and income. But I also, to construct these marital and fertility histories, I go to the individual panel studies of each country, and I combine them to create harmonized variables of marital and fertility histories in order to be able to track and pinpoint when each individual was cohabiting, when they weren't, when they were first cohabiting, when they had their first child, which are not available in the CNEF, so I had to harmonize them, giving information in each individual panel here study. So we have the US PSID, the German SWAP, the Korean CLIPS, SHP for Switzerland, the HILDA for Australia, and for the UK, we have the UK HLS and the BHBS. This is a breakdown of the sample. We have here the couple years. We track people from 2001 to 2018, roughly. And we have here the number of couples. Given all of these restrictions, in some countries, a number of couples falls, but these are essential in order to have robust estimates and really get at the causes and consequences of what we're looking at. So going to the results, the first question, how does within couple inequality change following the birth of the first child to the couple? So the figure shows that women's share of couples' earnings declines in all countries following childbirth, but to different degrees. Apart from the UK, across countries, women's earnings shares declines a year before childbirth. So although the most striking declines happens in the year of or following childbirth, the most notable decline in women's earnings share in the year of childbirth is in Germany, followed by Australia. And in the first year following childbirth, there is a steep decline in women's share in Switzerland, Germany, and the UK. And apart from South Korea, women's earnings share recovered very slowly and remained negative and statistically significant at least 6 years after first childbirth. Going on to the next question, so how does marriage and parenthood differently impact men's and women's earnings trajectory? So to further examine the mechanisms underlying within couple inequality and labor market outcomes across time, I now turn my attention to separate gender and country level analyses of the marital and parenthood labor market premiums. So the figure here summarizes the trajectories of the marital earnings premium by country for men over years since marriage, defined as the first co-residential union to the couple, restricted to those without kids before entering the union. The reference category are those who were never in a co-residential union, and I compare these results from the standard fixed effects, the black and red line, and the fixed effects individual slopes, the gray line, to test whether effects are driven by selection, not only on earnings level, but also on earnings growth. So for men in most countries, there is no statistically distinguishable difference between married and those never married, particularly once we control for selection on earnings growth. Now, for women, there is more variation across countries. For the US and Switzerland, I find statistically distinguishable marital earnings premium per women in both models. For the UK, the individual slopes model suggests that women receive a marital earnings premium in the beginning of partnerships. In Germany, while the fixed effects models are not statistically significant, once selection and earnings growth is accounted for, there is a positive and long-term positive effect of marriage on annual earnings. In Australia, both models suggest a long-term negative effect of marriage on earnings. And finally, in South Korea, once selection on earnings growth is accounted for, negative effects disappear. And given that the dependent variable in these models are logged annual earnings, it does not include those individuals who drop out of the labor force. Consequently, selection on labor force participation can bias these results. To test this and further analyses, I test the average effect of marriage and parenthood, respectively, on earnings levels, including any years with zero earnings. Those models now clearly suggest that only in Korea does marriage have a negative and long-term effect on women's earnings, even once selection and earnings growth is taken into account. So showing that in South Korea, there is a negative effect of marriage. Now, moving on to the question of fatherhood premiums, results show that once controlling for selection and earnings growth, only in Australia there is a statistically significant and long-lasting effect, negative effect of fatherhood on men's earnings. Only in South Korea do results suggest positive returns to fatherhood. However, coefficients only significant at a p-value of 0.1, which might reflect South Korea's smaller sample size. Now, going on to motherhood earnings premiums, apart from South Korea, all mothers incur an earnings penalty. Motherhood earnings penalties in the first years following the birth of the first child to the couple are by far largest in Germany. However, it is in the UK that motherhood penalty is significantly more long-lasting. And perhaps surprisingly, fixed effects models for the US show a more long-lasting motherhood earnings penalties, which just disappears after first year once the to-be mother's earnings growth is controlled for. This indicates that the US selection and earnings growth plays an important role in accounting for motherhood penalties. Now, moving on to the third question, and how does the birth of a first child to a couple impact total household incomes? Results from the previous sections largely suggest that men do not receive an earnings premium from family events, while women do incur a penalty from motherhood. Hence, we would expect that, in fact, family incomes would fall following the birth of a first child to a couple in first-time co-residential unions. This can be buffered if, for example, state transfers through child benefits or tax credits are enough to compensate for couples' earnings losses. This figure here shows the pre-tax income trajectory, which informs us of how incomes change following childbirth, driven largely by changing dynamics in couples' labor market earnings. Here we see that pre-tax household income declines significantly following childbirth in the UK, Australia, Switzerland, and Germany. However, there are some important cross-national variation among these countries that I want to highlight. In German households experience the steepest decline in the first year following childbirth. However, income recovery is much faster than in other countries. The UK shows the steepest sustained declines over time. For the US and South Korea, there is no evidence that the birth of a first child to a couple in first co-residential unions impact their pre-tax household incomes. The main question here is if welfare states are able to mitigate these income losses. The post-tax income model here to the right estimates the extent to which government redistribution through tax policies and direct transfers are able to buffer these observed pre-tax income losses. Comparing the panel to the left with the results to the right, we see that in European countries, welfare states do play an important role in mitigating labor market earnings declines associated with childbirth. The difference model, which is the difference between pre-tax and post-tax household incomes, offers the clearest pictures of redistribution. More negative values indicate stronger redistribution, meaning that the state plays a substantial role in offsetting household incomes. The UK exhibits some of the most negative values, suggesting that policies of taxes and transfers provide substantial compensation to families with children. However, it is still not enough to offset income losses, which remain significant across most of the observation window, as we saw in previous slides. Germany also shows strong redistribution, and in contrast, the US shows almost no change in the difference model, indicating that its tax and transfer system does little to alter family income trajectories. So how does family events affect household income trajectories? Well, there is an extensive literature on individual level wage returns to marriage, particularly among men, and parenthood, particularly in what concerns motherhood penalties. Much less is known about how these logically related issues impact household level economic well-being over time. What I tried to do in this study is to leverage the growing availability and maturity of longitudinal data sets across countries with different welfare state arrangements. And this studies integrates the family earnings gap within couple inequality and cross-national comparative literatures to provide a comprehensive investigation of how and why within family incomes are affected in the long term by family formation events. Results show that women's share of couple earnings declines following the birth of the first child to a couple across all countries, albeit to varying degrees. Findings suggest that increasing within couple inequality following childbirth is largely a result of penalties on mothers' labor market outcomes and not of men's premium. This increase within family gender inequality is not, however, translated to declining household income in all countries. In Germany, a country that provides more generous children-related benefits, is better at buffering income losses after the arrival of children, despite having one of the largest and most sustained drops in women's share of couples' earnings following childbirth. The UK, on the other hand, despite having the strongest state-level redistribution buffering mechanism, as evidenced by the event study difference model, is not enough to compensate for the steep market penalties that families incur following childbirth, particularly as a result of steep and long-lasting motherhood penalties. The US case is particularly striking. While pre-tax incomes remain relatively stable, the lack of meaningful redistribution leaves families without significant financial support following childbirth. This suggests that family income stability in the US relies almost entirely on market earnings with little state intervention to buffer income losses. That does align with expectations for a liberal welfare state where social policies prioritize labor market participation over direct family support. And finally, in South Korea, there is some indication of a slight upward trend in post-tax household income, which might stem from a stronger adherence to a neoclassical household specialization model in which male earnings dominate household incomes. While the study provides important contributions to the social stratification literature by identifying the impact of what might be termed first family formation events, which do tend to coincide with a crucial time of human capital formation in individuals' life cycle, which has important implication for lifetime earnings and income, the increased availability of longitudinal data sets today through both household surveys and administrative data allows for scholars to further this area of research so as to analyze ways that, for example, tax and social welfare policies might act as buffers to trigger events across different social economic groups in varying cross-national contexts. And by centering family formation as a pivotal gender life course event with long-run economic consequences, the family-triggered stratification trajectory model provides flexible conceptual framework to understanding how state-level and labor market structures shape individual-level outcomes that echo to family-level inequality. I just want to finalize by saying that as countries increasingly grapple with the looming demographic crisis associated with low fertility rates, understanding the connection between gender inequalities and labor market outcomes as families' long-term economic well-being is increasingly necessary. What this study shows is that the degree to which welfare regimes buffer or exacerbate economic shocks following childbirth is not merely a function of redistribution, but of whether policies are structured to address the magnitude and gendered nature of pre-tax losses. Thank you.